Money Loves an Organized Mind, The Psychology of Habits, Motivation, and a Calm, Productive Life, published by Limitless Growth Audiobook. Introduction. Most people do not wake up and decide to make their lives chaotic. It happens gradually. One unfinished task becomes 5. One distracted evening becomes a habit. A few postponed decisions begin occupying mental space. You make plans with good intentions, fall behind, feel frustrated, and then try to fix everything at once. For a while, you feel determined. Then, real life interrupts you, and the cycle begins again. This is not a story about becoming perfectly organized. It is about understanding why staying organized is difficult in the first place. Your mind is influenced by stress, emotions, habits, surroundings, expectations, fatigue, and the constant stream of information competing for your attention. Sometimes you know exactly what you should do and still avoid doing it. Sometimes you genuinely want to change but return to an old pattern without even noticing. That is where psychology becomes important. Money Loves an Organized Mind uses money as a metaphor for value. This audiobook does not provide financial advice. Instead, it examines how you handle the resources that shape your everyday experience: attention, time, energy, emotions, decisions, and habits. The journey ahead will not promise an effortless life. You will still have mornings when you lack motivation. Plans will sometimes fail. You will occasionally procrastinate, lose focus, react emotionally, or fall back into familiar behavior. The difference will come from what you do next. Rather than treating every setback as proof that you have failed, you will learn to examine what happened, what triggered the behavior, what made the better choice difficult, what could be changed next time. That shift from judging yourself to understanding yourself is where meaningful change begins. Throughout these chapters, we will follow a realistic journey from mental disorder toward greater clarity. Not perfection, not constant productivity, not endless discipline, just a gradual improvement in the way you think, choose, respond, and repeat. Because an organized mind is not a mind that never loses its way. It is a mind that learns how to find its way back. Chapter 1. Recognize the chaos running your life. At 7:15 on a Tuesday morning, Daniel was already behind. Nothing had gone terribly wrong. His alarm had gone off, his phone was charged, his clothes were ready, he had slept enough to function. Yet within 15 minutes of opening his eyes, he had already checked 3 messages, watched several short videos, answered a notification that could have waited, and remembered an assignment he had promised himself he would finish the night before. He stood in the kitchen making coffee while mentally listing everything he needed to do: work, the unfinished report, the appointment he needed to confirm, the exercise he had skipped twice, the email he had avoided, the book he wanted to read, the habit he wanted to start. The list grew faster than his coffee cooled. By the time he sat down at his desk, he felt tired. This was the part Daniel could never explain. He had not done anything physically demanding. He had not worked for 8 hours. He had not faced an emergency, yet his mind already felt crowded. For years, he assumed the problem was poor time management. Eventually, he realized something more uncomfortable. His problem was not that he had too little time. His problem was that his mind rarely finished one thing before beginning another. That distinction matters. Mental chaos is often difficult to notice because it does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like opening your laptop and immediately checking your phone. Sometimes it looks like thinking about tomorrow while someone is speaking to you today. Sometimes it looks like carrying 5 unfinished tasks in your head while completing none of them properly. Sometimes it looks like constantly reorganizing your plans because you never feel certain about what deserves attention. The mind can become cluttered without making a sound. And once that clutter becomes normal, you may stop recognizing it as a problem. You simply call yourself distracted. You call yourself inconsistent. You say you need more motivation. You promise that tomorrow will be different. Then tomorrow arrives with the same mental noise. The first step toward changing this pattern is not creating a sophisticated routine. It is noticing what is actually happening. Think about the last time you sat down to do something important and suddenly remembered 5 other things. You might have opened another tab to handle one of them. Then you noticed a message. Then you responded. Then you returned to the original task and couldn't remember where you were. Nothing about this sequence feels dangerous. But repeated thousands of times, it changes the way your attention works. You become accustomed to interruption. You begin expecting stimulation. You become uncomfortable with quiet. Simple tasks feel unusually difficult because your brain has learned to move rather than remain. This is why blaming yourself can be so ineffective. If you simply tell yourself to try harder, you are addressing the result without understanding the pattern. A more useful question is, what keeps pulling me away? That question changes the investigation. Perhaps you are not avoiding a task because you are lazy. Perhaps the task is unclear. Perhaps you are afraid of doing it badly. Perhaps you have made it larger in your mind than it actually is. Perhaps your environment makes distraction easier than concentration. Perhaps you are mentally exhausted before you begin. These possibilities do not excuse unhelpful behavior. They explain it, and explanation gives you something that self-criticism rarely provides: a place to begin. Daniel eventually tried something surprisingly uncomfortable. Instead of writing another productivity plan, he spent one evening observing himself. He did not attempt to improve anything. He simply watched. He noticed that whenever a difficult task appeared, he reached for his phone. When he felt uncertain about what to do next, he checked his messages. When a task seemed boring, he searched for something more stimulating. When he made a mistake, he immediately switched to something easier. By the end of the evening, Daniel had learned something important. His distractions were not random. They followed patterns. That discovery changed the way he saw himself. He had spent years thinking, "I am an undisciplined person." Now he could ask, under what circumstances do I become undisciplined? That is a much more useful question. The first statement attacks identity. The second investigates behavior, and behavior can be examined. You can identify triggers. You can recognize patterns. You can notice the moments when your attention disappears. You can observe what happens immediately before procrastination. You can identify which situations make you impulsive and which ones make you focused. This does not mean becoming obsessed with analyzing yourself. It means becoming honest enough to notice the sequence between a trigger and a response. Something happens. You feel something. Your mind produces an impulse, then you act. Most people focus only on the final action. Psychological growth begins when you start noticing the steps in between. Maybe someone sends a frustrating message and you immediately respond. Maybe you feel overwhelmed by a large task and decide to postpone it. Maybe you become tired and automatically reach for entertainment. Maybe you compare your progress with someone else and suddenly feel that your own efforts are pointless. The behavior may look different, but the structure is similar. Something triggers you. You react automatically. The reaction becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes familiar. Eventually, the familiar starts feeling like your personality. That is why awareness is more powerful than it first appears. You cannot deliberately change a pattern you refuse to see. But seeing it does not mean you have to fix everything today. In fact, trying to fix everything immediately can create another form of chaos. Instead, begin with observation. For one day, pay attention to the moments when you lose control of your attention. Notice when you switch tasks without finishing. Notice when you reach for your phone without consciously deciding to. Notice which responsibilities you repeatedly postpone. Notice what emotions tend to appear before avoidance. Do not judge the observations. Collect them. You are not building a case against yourself. You are building a map. Daniel's life did not change because he discovered a magical productivity technique. It changed because he finally became curious about his own behavior. That curiosity gave him something he had been missing for years, a starting point based on reality rather than frustration. Your life may not look like Daniel's. Your distractions may be different. Your responsibilities may be heavier or lighter. Your habits may have developed for completely different reasons. But the principle remains. Before you try to control your behavior, learn to recognize it. Before you redesign your routine, understand what keeps breaking it. Before you call yourself undisciplined, examine the circumstances in which discipline disappears. And before you attempt to organize your entire life, pause long enough to notice where the disorder actually begins, because you cannot create meaningful order by fighting a problem you have never clearly identified. The first victory is not doing more. It is seeing more clearly, and once you can see the pattern, you are no longer trapped inside it without understanding. You have finally found the door. Chapter 2. Decide what deserves your attention. A week after Daniel began observing his behavior, he made an uncomfortable discovery. He did not have an attention problem in the way he had always imagined. He had a selection problem. His attention was constantly being recruited by whatever happened to appear in front of him. An incoming message felt important because it was new. An email felt urgent because it was sitting unread. A new idea felt exciting because it promised immediate progress. Someone else's request felt impossible to ignore because saying no made him uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the work that actually mattered often remained untouched because it demanded patience rather than immediate reaction. Daniel had been treating every demand as if it deserved the same priority. That was the mistake. On Monday morning, he wrote down everything occupying his mind. The list was longer than he expected. There were work responsibilities, household tasks, personal goals, messages to answer, things to research, books he wanted to read, habits he wanted to develop, and several ideas he had promised himself he would explore. He stared at the page and felt overwhelmed. Then he noticed something. The list contained two very different categories of things: matters that genuinely required his attention and matters that merely wanted it. That distinction became the subject of his next experiment. He took each item and asked a simple question: if I ignored this for a week, what would actually happen? Some answers were obvious. A deadline would create a real problem. A necessary appointment needed attention. An important conversation could not be postponed indefinitely. Other items suddenly looked much less important. A message could wait. A video could be skipped. A new idea did not need to become a project. A minor inconvenience did not require immediate correction. An article did not need to be read simply because it had appeared in his feed. For the first time, Daniel saw how often urgency was being confused with importance. Modern life makes this confusion easy. Anything capable of producing a notification can create the feeling that it deserves an immediate response. But a notification is not a command. An interruption is not automatically a priority. Someone else's urgency does not always become your responsibility. This does not mean becoming indifferent. It means becoming selective. Attention is limited. Every time you give it to one thing, you temporarily withhold it from another. You cannot be deeply present everywhere at once. That sounds obvious, yet daily behavior often contradicts it. People attempt to listen while checking their phones. They work while answering messages. They plan tomorrow while worrying about yesterday. They pursue several goals while wondering why none of them is progressing. The issue is not always a lack of effort. Sometimes effort is simply being divided into pieces too small to create meaningful movement. Daniel decided to test what would happen if he stopped trying to keep everything moving. He chose one responsibility that had been sitting unfinished for several days. It was not exciting. Nobody would applaud him for completing it. But it mattered. He closed the unnecessary tabs on his computer. He put his phone across the room. He wrote down exactly what finished meant. Then he worked. 20 minutes passed, then 40. He was surprised by how much mental energy had previously been spent deciding what to do next. The task itself had not become easier. The competition around it had become quieter. This was an important distinction. Organization is not always about increasing your capacity. Sometimes it is about reducing the number of things competing for that capacity. Daniel began experimenting with a rule. Before accepting a new commitment, he would pause. Not forever, just long enough to ask 3 questions. Does this matter? Does this matter now? Does this need to be done by me? The questions were simple, but they exposed assumptions he had rarely challenged. Sometimes something mattered, but not today. Sometimes something mattered to someone else, but was not actually his responsibility. Sometimes something sounded important only because it arrived loudly. He also discovered something about his own behavior that was harder to admit. He often said yes because saying yes gave him immediate relief. If someone asked for help, agreeing ended the discomfort of deciding. If a friend suggested a plan, accepting avoided the awkwardness of declining. If a new project appeared, volunteering made him feel productive. But every yes had a hidden cost. It occupied space. And when too many things occupied space, the responsibilities he had deliberately chosen began receiving the leftovers. This is where personal organization becomes psychological rather than mechanical. A calendar can show you where your time goes. It cannot tell you whether the things filling your calendar deserve your life. That decision belongs to you. Daniel began noticing the emotional side of prioritization. Sometimes he avoided important work because it made him uncomfortable. Sometimes he chose easy tasks because completing them gave him a quick sense of accomplishment. Sometimes he checked messages because uncertainty was harder to tolerate than distraction. So he created another question. Am I choosing this because it matters or because it makes me feel better right now? That question changed several of his habits. He began recognizing the difference between productive action and emotional escape. Cleaning his desk could be useful, but cleaning it for an hour to avoid difficult work was avoidance wearing a productive costume. Research could be valuable, but endlessly researching instead of beginning could become procrastination with better vocabulary. Planning could create clarity, but repeatedly redesigning the plan could become another way of avoiding execution. The point was not to distrust every productive-looking activity. It was to examine the reason behind the activity. Over time, Daniel developed a more realistic relationship with priorities. He stopped trying to identify the perfect list of everything that mattered. Instead, he asked what mattered now. That small word changed everything. Now, not someday, not eventually, not everything. Just now. He began choosing one meaningful direction for a block of time and allowing other concerns to remain temporarily unresolved. That was difficult at first. His mind kept suggesting that he might forget something, so he wrote things down. This simple habit gave his brain permission to stop holding every unfinished thought. A notebook became a place where future responsibilities could wait without demanding constant mental attention. He did not solve every problem. He simply stopped carrying every problem simultaneously. And that made him calmer. The lesson was becoming clear. An organized mind is not one that pays attention to everything. It is one that understands that attention must be allocated deliberately. You will never have enough time to satisfy every request, pursue every interest, answer every message, consume every piece of information, and complete every idea. That is not a personal failure. That is reality. The mature response is not to demand more from yourself. It is to choose more carefully. Today, try Daniel's experiment. Write down the things competing for your attention, then separate them into 3 groups. What genuinely matters, what can wait, and what does not deserve your attention at all. Do not create a perfect life from the list. Create a clearer next step. Choose one thing that matters and give it your undivided attention for a defined period. Then let the other things wait. You may discover that your life does not require more attention. It requires better decisions about where your attention goes. And that is where real organization begins. Chapter 3. Make change small enough to repeat. After Daniel learned to choose where his attention belonged, he expected the next step to be easier. He had identified the distractions. He had clarified his priorities. He knew which responsibilities mattered. Surely, knowing what needed to happen would make doing it simple. It did not. One Saturday morning, Daniel decided he was finally going to fix his routine. He made a long list. Exercise every morning, read for an hour, eliminate unnecessary screen time, prepare his meals, keep his workspace organized, finish unfinished projects, and spend time learning something useful. The list looked impressive. By Monday evening, most of it was already abandoned. Daniel had made a familiar mistake. He had designed a routine for the person he hoped to become rather than the person he actually was. He wanted immediate evidence that he was changing, so he demanded immediate perfection. This time, however, he did something different. Instead of criticizing himself, he asked a more practical question. What is the smallest version of this behavior I could realistically repeat? That question changed the experiment. Instead of exercising for an hour, he started with 10 minutes. Instead of reading an entire chapter, he read 5 pages. Instead of trying to eliminate every distraction, he put his phone away during one focused period. None of these actions felt impressive. That was precisely why they worked. A behavior does not need to look dramatic to be meaningful. It needs to happen often enough to become familiar. Daniel began noticing something interesting. The first few repetitions required conscious effort. After several days, the actions felt less unusual. He did not have to negotiate with himself as much. The behavior was becoming part of the landscape of his day. This is one of the overlooked realities of habit formation. Repetition changes the psychological cost of an action. At first, something unfamiliar demands attention. You have to remember it, decide to do it, and push through resistance. With repetition, some of that effort decreases. The behavior becomes easier to initiate because it is no longer completely new. But there was another lesson Daniel had to learn. A small habit was not supposed to remain small forever, simply because small felt comfortable. The purpose was to establish reliability first. He was building evidence that he could act consistently. That evidence mattered more than intensity. For years, Daniel had measured himself by his best days. If he exercised for an hour, worked for 6 focused hours, and followed his routine perfectly, he felt disciplined. When the next week became difficult, he judged himself by the same standard and felt like a failure. Now he began measuring something different. How often do I return? If he missed a workout, did he disappear for 2 weeks, or did he return the next day? If he skipped reading, did he abandon the habit, or did he continue when the opportunity returned? If a distracted afternoon ruined his focus, did he decide the entire day was lost? The answer increasingly became no. This changed his relationship with consistency. Consistency was no longer a demand to perform perfectly every day. It became a willingness to continue after imperfect days. That distinction made his habits more durable. Daniel also learned to attach new behaviors to things that already happened. After making coffee, he spent a few minutes reviewing his priorities. After finishing work, he cleared his desk. Before going to bed, he wrote down anything important that needed attention the next day. These actions required little effort because they had a place in an existing sequence. He was not trying to remember dozens of new instructions. He was creating connections between behaviors. Still, some habits remained difficult. Daniel discovered that difficulty was useful information. If a behavior repeatedly failed, he stopped immediately blaming his discipline and examined the design. Was the action too large? Was the timing unrealistic? Was something in the environment interfering? Was the reward too distant? Was he expecting himself to behave like someone with completely different circumstances? Sometimes the answer was yes, so he adjusted. That adjustment was not weakness, it was problem-solving. Realistic personal growth requires this flexibility. A habit that only works when everything goes perfectly is not a strong habit. A useful behavior should survive ordinary life. There would be tired mornings, unexpected responsibilities, bad moods, travel, stress, missed days. The goal was to create habits that could bend without breaking. Daniel eventually understood why his earlier attempts had failed. He had been trying to prove his discipline through intensity. Now he was building discipline through repetition. Those are very different things. One creates temporary excitement. The other creates familiarity. So choose one behavior you genuinely want to strengthen. Make it almost embarrassingly manageable. Define the smallest version you can perform even on an ordinary, imperfect day. Then repeat it. Do not immediately add 5 more habits because the first one feels easy. Give yourself time to establish evidence. You are not trying to impress yourself. You are teaching yourself something more valuable. When I decide to act, I can return to that action again and again. That belief is not created by positive thinking. It is built through evidence. Small actions provide the evidence. Repeated actions strengthen it. And eventually, what once required deliberate effort begins to feel like something you simply do. That is how change becomes real, not through one extraordinary day, but through ordinary actions repeated until they become part of you. Chapter 4. Move before motivation gives you permission. Daniel had learned to make his habits smaller, but he soon discovered that even a simple habit could become difficult when his mood changed. On some mornings, getting started felt natural. On others, he could find a dozen reasons to wait. One Thursday morning, he woke up tired. Nothing was seriously wrong, but he had slept poorly and felt mentally heavy. His plan was simple: spend 15 minutes exercising before beginning work. He looked at his shoes. "I'll do it later," he thought. The sentence sounded harmless. But Daniel knew that later had often been where his good intentions disappeared. He had spent years assuming motivation would arrive before action. If he felt energetic, he started. If he felt inspired, he worked. If he felt confident, he made progress. When those feelings were missing, he interpreted the absence as a signal to wait. Eventually, he recognized the flaw. Motivation was useful, but it was unreliable. It changed with sleep, stress, environment, mood, health, circumstances, and even something as simple as what had happened earlier that day. If his behavior depended entirely on feeling motivated, his consistency would always be unstable. So Daniel tried something different. He stopped asking, "Do I feel like doing this?" Instead, he asked, "What is the smallest action that keeps the commitment alive?" That morning, he did not promise himself a full workout. He put on his shoes. That was the first decision. Then he stepped outside. He walked for 10 minutes. When he returned, he did not feel dramatically transformed. There was no sudden burst of enthusiasm, but something more valuable had happened. He had acted without waiting for the perfect feeling. That became an important lesson. Discipline does not mean forcing yourself through every situation. Sometimes tiredness means you genuinely need recovery. Sometimes frustration reveals that something in your routine needs to change. Sometimes a goal no longer deserves your energy. But there are other moments when resistance is simply resistance. The task is boring. The beginning feels uncomfortable. You are uncertain. You would rather do something easier. You are waiting for confidence. Learning to tell the difference is part of maturity. Daniel began noticing that his strongest avoidance often appeared immediately before the most uncomfortable part of a task. He might sit down to write and suddenly want to organize his desk. He might open a difficult project and suddenly remember several minor errands. He might begin reading something challenging and feel an urgent need to check his phone. These distractions were not always random. They often appeared when discomfort appeared. Once Daniel recognized this pattern, he stopped treating every impulse as an instruction. When he wanted to escape a task, he asked, "What am I trying not to feel?" Sometimes the answer was boredom, sometimes uncertainty, sometimes fear of doing poor work, sometimes simply the discomfort of beginning. That question gave him a choice. He could still stop if stopping was reasonable, but he no longer automatically confused discomfort with danger. Daniel also changed the way he thought about motivation. He stopped expecting motivation to be the starting point. Often, motivation appeared after action. Beginning created momentum. Momentum made continuing easier. Completion created satisfaction. Satisfaction encouraged another attempt. The sequence was often the reverse of what he had believed. He had been waiting to feel ready so he could act. Now he acted, and sometimes readiness followed. This did not make every task enjoyable. That was another important realization. A disciplined life is not a life where everything becomes exciting. Some useful things remain ordinary, some responsibilities remain boring, some habits remain inconvenient. The goal is not to make every action feel good. The goal is to stop requiring pleasure before allowing yourself to act. Daniel began using short starting points. 5 minutes of reading, 10 minutes of movement, 15 minutes on a difficult task, 1 cleared surface, 1 completed email, 1 page written. The purpose was not always to finish. It was to cross the psychological barrier of beginning. Once he started, continuing was often easier, and when it wasn't, he could still stop knowing he had made a deliberate choice rather than automatically obeying avoidance. That distinction strengthened his self-trust. He was learning that he could feel reluctant and still move. He could feel uncertain and still begin. He could feel tired and still complete a reasonable minimum. He could have an imperfect day without abandoning the entire system. That is a far more realistic form of discipline than constant enthusiasm. So the next time you catch yourself saying, "I'll do it when I feel motivated," pause. Ask whether motivation is genuinely necessary. If it is not, reduce the action. Make the beginning smaller. Do not negotiate with yourself for an hour. Take the first physical step. Open the document, stand up, put on the shoes, write the first sentence, read the first page. Begin before your mind has finished producing reasons to wait. You do not need to become someone who is always motivated. You need to become someone who can move even when motivation is temporarily absent, because motivation comes and goes. But a person who learns to act deliberately can keep moving. And every time you begin without waiting for permission from your mood, you strengthen something more valuable than motivation. You strengthen the belief that your actions can be guided by your decisions, not controlled by your feelings. Chapter 5. Reshape the environment that shapes you. Daniel had become better at starting difficult things, but another pattern kept frustrating him. He could make a good decision in the morning and completely forget that decision by evening. One night, he planned to read before bed. The book was waiting on his desk. He walked into the room, saw his phone beside the pillow, and picked it up just to check one message. 40 minutes disappeared. Daniel put the phone down and felt disappointed. His first thought was familiar. "I need more discipline." Then he looked around the room. The phone was within reach. The television remote was on the table. His laptop was already open. The book was several steps away. Suddenly the situation looked different. Perhaps the problem was not simply his willpower. Perhaps his surroundings were constantly making some choices easier than others. That realization changed his approach. Instead of asking, "How can I become strong enough to resist every distraction?" Daniel asked, "How can I make the behavior I want easier to begin?" The question was simple, but it led to practical changes. He stopped keeping his phone beside his bed. He placed his book where he could immediately see it. He kept his workspace clear enough that beginning work required little preparation. He removed unnecessary notifications. He moved distracting applications away from his most frequently used devices. None of these changes transformed his personality. They changed the path his behavior followed. That distinction matters. People often treat discipline as a constant battle against temptation. But repeatedly placing yourself next to a distraction and then expecting perfect self-control can make ordinary life unnecessarily difficult. Your surroundings are always sending signals. A phone on the table invites checking. A television already playing invites watching. A messy desk can make beginning feel harder. A prepared workspace can make action feel natural. A book left open can remind you to read. A pair of shoes beside the door can make movement easier to start. The environment does not force your behavior, but it influences what becomes convenient. Daniel began looking at his surroundings differently. He asked, "What behaviors does this environment make easy?" That question revealed more than he expected. His kitchen made certain habits automatic. His bedroom encouraged late-night screen use. His desk invited multitasking. His phone created constant interruptions. He did not need to redesign his entire life. He simply needed to change a few pathways. For one habit he wanted to strengthen, he reduced friction. For one habit he wanted to reduce, he increased it. If he wanted to read, he kept the book visible. If he wanted fewer distractions, he placed the phone farther away. If he wanted to begin work quickly, he prepared his materials beforehand. These were small adjustments, but they reduced the number of decisions required. Daniel also realized that his environment included more than physical objects. It included people. Certain conversations left him energized and focused. Others consistently pulled him toward complaining, comparison, or unnecessary drama. He did not decide that difficult people were automatically bad influences. Instead, he became more aware of patterns. How did he feel after certain conversations? What attitudes did he repeatedly absorb? Which relationships encouraged the person he wanted to become? Which situations repeatedly triggered behaviors he was trying to change? Awareness helped him choose where to place more of his time and attention. Then he examined his digital environment. This was especially important because his phone carried hundreds of possible distractions in one small device. Messages, videos, news, entertainment, social platforms, notifications, opinions, every item could compete for attention. Daniel did not try to eliminate technology, he created boundaries around it. During focused work, the phone stayed away. During conversations, unnecessary notifications were ignored. Before sleep, the device no longer remained beside him. He was not trying to become perfectly disciplined. He was reducing the number of battles he had to fight. That became one of his most useful principles. Make the desired behavior convenient and the unwanted behavior inconvenient, not impossible, just less automatic. This approach also changed how Daniel responded when he slipped. Instead of immediately blaming himself, he inspected the environment. What made the distraction so easy? What could be moved? What could be prepared? What could be removed? This turned failure into information. If a habit repeatedly broke in the same place, perhaps the system needed adjustment. That was more useful than simply promising to try harder. Look around your own environment today. Choose one habit you want to strengthen. Ask what could make it easier. Prepare something, move something closer, remove one unnecessary step. Then choose one behavior you want to reduce. Ask what could make it slightly harder. Move the trigger, turn off an alert, create distance. Add one extra step between the impulse and the action. You are not surrendering responsibility to your environment. You are designing your surroundings to support the responsibility you already accept. Daniel eventually understood that discipline has two sides. One side is internal. choosing deliberately. The other is external, creating conditions that support those choices. When the two work together, progress becomes more realistic. You no longer have to rely on heroic self-control every hour. Your environment quietly helps reinforce the behavior you want. And sometimes the smartest way to become more disciplined is not to demand more strength from yourself. It is to stop making the right choice unnecessarily difficult. Chapter 6. Train your attention to stay where you put it. Daniel had learned to make action easier by changing his environment, but a new problem became impossible to ignore. Even when distractions were removed, his mind still wandered. He could sit at a quiet desk with his phone out of reach and suddenly find himself thinking about an unrelated conversation, an unfinished task, or something he had seen earlier. For years, Daniel had assumed focus meant being able to concentrate for hours without interruption. That definition made concentration feel like a talent other people possessed. He began questioning it. What if focus was not the absence of wandering? What if focus was the ability to notice wandering and return? That idea changed his expectations. One afternoon, Daniel sat down to work on an important project. After several minutes, he noticed himself staring at the same paragraph without absorbing it. His mind had drifted. Previously, he would have become frustrated and thought, "I can't concentrate." This time, he simply noticed it. Then he returned to the task. A few minutes later, it happened again. Notice, return, again, notice, return. The session was not perfectly focused, but it was productive. Daniel realized that concentration could be trained like a physical skill. The goal was not to prevent every distraction. The goal was to strengthen the ability to come back. That distinction removed a lot of unnecessary frustration. He began practicing with short periods of deliberate attention. He would choose one task and give it his full attention for a limited period. No switching, no checking, no preparing to do something else, just one thing. At first, even short periods felt surprisingly difficult. His brain had become accustomed to constant novelty. Whenever a task became slightly boring, his attention searched for something more stimulating. Daniel stopped treating that impulse as a command. He could notice boredom without immediately escaping it. He could feel restlessness without reaching for his phone. He could encounter difficulty without switching to an easier task. This did not mean he worked endlessly. Rest remained important. The difference was that rest became a conscious choice rather than an automatic escape. Daniel also discovered that multitasking had been creating more mental noise than he realized. He used to believe he was efficient when he answered messages while working, listened to something while reading, and switched between several responsibilities. In reality, his attention was repeatedly changing direction. Each switch had a cost. So he experimented with single tasking. When reading, he read. When writing, he wrote. When talking to someone, he listened. When eating, he occasionally ate without another screen competing for attention. The simplicity felt unusual at first. Then it became refreshing. Daniel noticed another important pattern. Attention follows interest, but interest can be trained. A task does not have to be exciting before it deserves concentration. Sometimes the satisfaction comes after staying with it long enough to understand it. That was particularly useful when he encountered difficult work. Instead of asking, "Is this interesting?" he asked, "Is this worth my attention?" The question was stronger. Not everything interesting was valuable. Not everything valuable was immediately interesting. He began choosing based on importance rather than stimulation. Daniel also started protecting the beginning of important tasks. He learned that the first few minutes often determined whether he would settle into concentration or drift into distraction. So he created a simple starting ritual. Clear the immediate workspace. Identify the exact task. Begin with one visible action, then continue. The ritual gave his brain a recognizable signal that it was time to focus. He also stopped expecting himself to concentrate equally well at every hour of the day. Some periods were naturally stronger than others. Instead of fighting his energy constantly, he learned to place demanding tasks where his attention was usually better and simpler responsibilities where it was weaker. This was not about creating a perfect schedule. It was about paying attention to his own patterns. The more Daniel practiced returning, the less dramatic distraction became. He no longer interpreted every wandering thought as failure. A thought appeared, he noticed, he returned. That was the practice. If you want to strengthen your own attention, begin smaller than your ambition suggests. Choose one task. Give it a defined period. Remove obvious distractions. When your mind wanders, do not insult yourself. Return. If it wanders again, return again. The repetition matters. Focus is not proven by never losing attention. It is developed every time you consciously bring attention back. Daniel eventually understood that his mind did not need to become perfectly still. It needed direction. An organized mind is not one that never wanders. It is one that can recognize where it has wandered and deliberately come home. Chapter 7. Build a rhythm that can survive real life. Daniel had learned how to start without waiting for motivation, shape his environment, and bring his attention back when it wandered. For a while, he believed the next step was to create the perfect routine. He tried. He designed mornings that looked impressive on paper. Wake up early, exercise, read, plan, work deeply, eat perfectly, finish everything on schedule. For 3 days, it worked. On the 4th day, Daniel woke up late. A responsibility appeared unexpectedly. His energy was low. By evening, the entire routine had collapsed. Daniel felt the familiar disappointment. I need more discipline. But this time he questioned the conclusion. Maybe the routine was not designed for a real person. It was designed for an imaginary version of himself who had unlimited energy, predictable days, and no unexpected problems. That realization changed everything. Daniel stopped trying to build a schedule that worked only when life behaved perfectly. He began building a rhythm that could bend. A rhythm is different from a rigid routine. A routine can tell you exactly what to do at a specific time. A rhythm gives your day structure while allowing circumstances to change. Daniel identified a few behaviors that mattered most. He needed time for meaningful work. He needed movement. He needed periods without constant stimulation. He needed enough recovery to function well. Everything else could be adjusted. This made difficult days easier. When he had plenty of energy, he could do more. When the day became crowded, he could do less without abandoning the entire direction. For example, instead of requiring a long workout, he created a minimum version. If he had time, he exercised fully. If he did not, he walked or moved for a short period. The purpose was not to maintain a perfect record. It was to maintain continuity. Daniel discovered that continuity was psychologically powerful. Missing one day was not usually the real problem. The real problem was the story that followed. I already failed, so the week is ruined. Then one missed day became 3. A difficult week became a lost month. Daniel replaced that pattern with a simple rule. Reduce the habit before you abandon it. When life became demanding, he made the action smaller instead of disappearing completely. This principle applied to almost everything. A complicated planning session could become 3 minutes of reviewing priorities. A long reading session could become a few pages. A demanding workout could become a walk. A large project could become one clearly defined action. The smaller version preserved the identity and kept the path visible. Daniel also learned to stop treating rest as a reward he had to earn. He had once believed that productive people should always be doing something, but constant activity eventually damaged the very attention he depended on. Rest became part of the rhythm. not endless entertainment, not avoidance disguised as recovery, actual pauses, time away from demands, sleep, quiet, simple activities that allowed his mind to stop performing. He also began planning around energy instead of only around time. A task might take 30 minutes, but the mental cost could vary greatly depending on when he attempted it. He noticed that difficult thinking required a different kind of energy than routine work, so he stopped expecting himself to perform at maximum intensity all day. Some hours were for concentration, some were for administration, some were for movement, some were for recovery. This made his days feel less like a race. Another important change was accepting seasonal variation. There were periods when Daniel had more responsibilities. There were periods when he had more freedom. There were weeks when growth was easy, and weeks when maintaining stability was the real achievement. He stopped demanding the same performance from himself under completely different circumstances. That was not lowering standards. It was recognizing reality. A useful rhythm should survive ordinary disruption. It should not collapse because you slept badly one night, received unexpected news, became busy, or simply had an unusually difficult day. So Daniel began asking a better question. Can this routine still work when my day goes wrong? If the answer was no, he simplified it. Your own routine deserves the same test. Do not design it around your best day. Design it around your real life. Choose a few anchors that matter. Create a minimum version for difficult days. Allow room for recovery. Adjust according to energy. And when the rhythm breaks, return without drama. You do not need a perfect schedule. You need a structure flexible enough to keep you moving. Daniel finally understood that consistency was not about repeating identical days. It was about maintaining direction through different kinds of days. Some days you sprint, some days you walk, some days you stop and recover, but you know where you are going. That is a rhythm that can survive real life. Chapter 8. Eliminate the choices that drain your mind. Daniel had finally learned that a good routine did not need to control every hour of his day. He could adjust when life changed, reduce habits when energy was low, and return after interruptions. Yet another source of exhaustion remained. He was making too many small decisions. One morning, Daniel stood in his kitchen trying to decide what to eat. A few minutes later, he was deciding what to wear. Then he wondered whether to exercise before work or after. Once he sat at his desk, another question appeared. Which task should he start first? None of these choices seemed important, but by the time Daniel reached his first serious task, his mind already felt busy. That was when he recognized something important. Mental exhaustion does not always come from difficult decisions. Sometimes it comes from making too many unnecessary ones. Daniel began paying attention to repeated choices. What time should he start? Where should he work? When should he answer messages? When should he exercise? What should he do when he finished one task? What should he prepare for tomorrow? He realized that many of these questions did not deserve fresh consideration every day, so he started creating defaults, not rigid rules. Defaults. He chose a general starting period for focused work. He created a consistent place for important items. He prepared certain things the night before. He decided that messages did not need immediate responses unless something was genuinely urgent. Each decision removed from his daily mental workload created a little more space. Daniel discovered that organization was partly the art of deciding once, when possible. If something repeatedly needed the same answer, he stopped reopening the question. This became especially useful with small responsibilities. Instead of wondering when to handle them, he grouped similar tasks together. Instead of remembering every obligation mentally, he recorded them. Instead of constantly asking what needed to happen next, he created a short list of meaningful priorities. The goal was not to become rigid. The goal was to reduce unnecessary internal conversation. Daniel also noticed another source of decision fatigue: unfinished choices. Some responsibilities were not difficult because they required much effort. They were difficult because he had not decided what to do with them. An unanswered message, an undecided appointment, a project without a clear next step, a task he kept mentally postponing. These things stayed in the background. So Daniel began closing open loops. If something required action, he recorded the next step. If it required a decision, he gave himself a time to decide. If it was no longer important, he removed it. This simple process made his mind quieter. He no longer needed to remember everything simply to make sure nothing disappeared. His system could remember for him. Daniel also became more careful about commitments. He used to say yes quickly because saying yes felt easier in the moment. Later, the commitment would occupy his schedule, attention, and energy. Now he paused before agreeing. What will this require from me? The question changed his behavior. He did not reject every request. He simply stopped treating every request as automatically deserving a yes. This protected his future attention. Daniel learned another valuable lesson. Decision fatigue becomes worse when you are already depleted. When he was exhausted, even small choices felt unnecessarily difficult. So he avoided making important decisions when he was emotionally or mentally drained whenever possible. He could postpone a non-essential decision. He could sleep before responding. He could revisit the issue when his thinking was clearer. That was not avoidance. It was choosing a better mental state for an important decision. The same principle worked with emotional situations. Daniel no longer responded immediately to every frustrating message. He created space. He asked whether the situation actually required a response. Sometimes it did. Sometimes waiting made the response better. Sometimes no response was necessary. He was learning that every reaction creates consequences, and every unnecessary reaction consumes energy. You can apply the same idea to your own life. Look at the choices you make repeatedly. Which ones can become defaults? What can you prepare ahead of time? What can you write down instead of carrying mentally? Which commitments could you reconsider? Which decisions are you repeatedly reopening? Start with one. Simplify it. Then observe what changes. Daniel discovered that a calmer mind was not necessarily a mind with fewer responsibilities. It was a mind that did not waste energy treating every small choice as a major decision. When the unnecessary decisions disappeared, important decisions became easier to see, and that gave Daniel something more valuable than efficiency. It gave him mental room, room to think, room to focus, room to respond carefully, room to rest. Sometimes becoming more organized does not mean adding another system. Sometimes it means removing one more decision from your day. Chapter 9. Pause before your emotions choose for you. Daniel had become better at organizing his time, attention, environment, and decisions. But one area remained unpredictable: his emotional reactions. He noticed it on an ordinary afternoon when a message appeared on his phone. The message was brief and critical. Daniel immediately felt irritation. His fingers moved toward the keyboard before he had fully processed what he was feeling. He started typing a sharp response, defending himself point by point. Then he stopped. He looked at the screen and recognized the pattern. He was not responding to the situation. He was responding to the emotion the situation had triggered. Daniel put the phone down. Nothing had been solved yet, but nothing had been made worse either. That moment taught him something important. Emotional discipline does not mean eliminating emotion. It means creating enough space between feeling something and acting on it. Daniel began noticing how quickly his reactions happened. Frustration led to criticism. Anxiety led to avoidance. Disappointment led to discouragement. Boredom led to distraction. The emotion appeared and a familiar behavior followed. He had assumed that was simply how he was. Now he wondered whether it was simply what he had practiced. The distinction mattered. If emotional reactions could become patterns, perhaps deliberate responses could become patterns too. So Daniel started practicing the pause. When he felt a strong reaction, he did not immediately demand that the feeling disappear. He noticed it, he named it, then he waited. Sometimes the pause lasted only a few breaths, sometimes it lasted an hour. For important conversations, it occasionally meant waiting until the next day. The goal was not to avoid difficult conversations, it was to enter them with a clearer mind. Daniel discovered that emotions often became less overwhelming when he stopped fighting them. Instead of saying, "I shouldn't be angry," he could say, "I'm angry." Instead of, "I can't handle this," he could recognize, "I'm feeling overwhelmed." Naming the experience created distance. He was experiencing an emotion, but he was not required to become the emotion. This became especially useful when he was tired. Daniel noticed that his patience was lower when he had not rested properly. Small inconveniences seemed larger. Minor interruptions felt personal. Decisions that normally required little thought suddenly became irritating. He began respecting that pattern. When depleted, he avoided unnecessary arguments. He postponed important messages when possible. He reduced demands instead of expecting himself to operate at full capacity. This was not an excuse for poor behavior. It was awareness. Daniel learned that prevention was often easier than repair. He also started questioning the stories that appeared alongside strong emotions. Someone did not respond to his message. His mind immediately said, "They are ignoring me." A project went poorly. His mind said, "I'm terrible at this." Someone criticized his work. His mind said, "They don't respect me." Daniel began asking, "What do I actually know?" That question interrupted assumptions. Perhaps the person was busy. Perhaps the project simply needed adjustment. Perhaps the criticism contained useful information. The emotion could remain real without every interpretation being true. This became one of Daniel's most valuable mental habits. Feelings deserve acknowledgement. They do not always deserve authority. Sometimes anger points toward a genuine problem. Sometimes it exaggerates a small one. Sometimes fear identifies real uncertainty. Sometimes it predicts disasters that never happen. The skill is learning to listen without automatically obeying. Daniel also stopped believing that immediate expression was always the same as honesty. He could be truthful without being reckless. He could say, "That bothered me," without attacking. He could set a boundary without humiliating someone. He could disagree without turning disagreement into a personal battle. The pause gave him control over the form his honesty took. If you want to practice this yourself, start with one simple question. What response will I respect tomorrow? Ask it when you are angry. Ask it when you are embarrassed. Ask it when you feel rejected. Ask it when you want to quit. The question shifts your attention away from immediate relief and toward longer-term self-respect. Daniel still experienced strong emotions. He still made mistakes. He still occasionally reacted too quickly, but he became better at catching himself. And that was progress. Emotional maturity was not becoming permanently calm. It was becoming harder for temporary feelings to make permanent decisions. Daniel eventually understood that a truly organized mind is not organized only on paper. It is organized in moments of pressure. When something goes wrong, you have a choice: react automatically or create a small space. Inside that space is your ability to think. Inside that space is your ability to choose. And sometimes the most powerful action you can take is not to respond immediately. It is to pause long enough to become the person who should respond. Chapter 10. Keep small promises and strengthen self-trust. Daniel had spent months improving his routines, protecting his attention, simplifying decisions, and becoming more deliberate with his emotions. From the outside, his life looked more organized, but internally, he discovered one question that mattered more than any planner or schedule. Could he trust himself? The question appeared one evening when Daniel opened an old notebook. Inside were promises he had made to himself months earlier. Read every day, exercise consistently, stop wasting time, finish important projects, become more disciplined. He remembered writing those promises with genuine determination. At the time, he had believed every word, yet many of those commitments had disappeared after a few difficult days. Daniel realized something uncomfortable. Every time he repeatedly promised himself something and failed to follow through, his own words became slightly less convincing. He could say, "I'll do it tomorrow," but another part of him had learned not to believe it. This was not a character flaw. It was accumulated evidence. Self-trust, Daniel realized, is not created by repeating positive statements. It develops when your actions give you reasons to believe yourself. So he stopped making dramatic promises. Instead of promising to exercise every day, he committed to a realistic schedule. Instead of promising to work for hours without distraction, he protected one focused period. Instead of deciding that his entire life would change on Monday, he chose one behavior he could actually maintain. The promises became smaller, but they became more reliable, and something surprising happened. Daniel started believing himself again. Every time he completed a commitment, he created evidence. "I said I would do this, and I did." The statement was simple. Its psychological effect was powerful. He also learned that self-trust does not require perfection. Sometimes circumstances interfere. Sometimes energy disappears. Sometimes a commitment turns out to be unrealistic. The important question is what happens afterward. Daniel had once missed one habit and treated the mistake as proof that he was incapable of consistency. Now, he returned. If he skipped a workout, he resumed the next reasonable opportunity. If he missed a planned work session, he adjusted the schedule. If a goal no longer made sense, he changed it deliberately instead of abandoning everything impulsively. Recovery became part of discipline. Daniel also stopped making promises while emotionally charged. After a frustrating day, he might once have declared, "Tomorrow I am completely changing my life." Those promises felt powerful because they gave him immediate relief. But dramatic motivation rarely survived ordinary mornings. He began making commitments when he was calm enough to consider reality. Could he actually maintain this? Would this still make sense on a difficult day? What would happen if something unexpected interrupted the plan? Those questions produced less excitement but more stability. Daniel then began examining the difference between intention and behavior. He had often judged himself by what he meant to do. Now he looked at what he repeatedly did. If he claimed that focus mattered but constantly interrupted himself, his behavior revealed a contradiction. If he said rest was important but consistently ignored his need for recovery, his actions told another story. This was not an invitation to criticize himself. It was an invitation to become honest. Your behavior is information. It shows you what your current systems, priorities, and habits are actually producing. Once Daniel accepted that, he could make better adjustments. He no longer needed to protect an ideal image of himself. He could simply observe. What am I repeatedly doing? What does that pattern create? Or what needs to change? That level of honesty strengthened his self-respect. Daniel also learned to separate a broken promise from a broken identity. Missing one commitment did not mean he was unreliable. Losing focus one afternoon did not mean he lacked discipline. Having an emotional reaction did not mean he had failed to grow. The mistake was real, but it did not have to become a permanent label. He could correct it. That became one of his strongest habits. Correct quickly, return without drama, continue. Over time, Daniel noticed a quieter form of confidence developing. He no longer needed to constantly convince himself that he was disciplined. He had evidence. He knew he could start difficult tasks. He knew he could return after setbacks. He knew he could pause before reacting. He knew he could make realistic commitments and honor them. His confidence was no longer based entirely on how he felt. It was based on what he had repeatedly done. That is the kind of confidence that survives difficult days. If you want to strengthen your own self-trust, begin with one promise. Make it small. Make it specific. Make it realistic enough that you can keep it even when motivation drops. Then keep it. Do not create 10 new commitments because you feel inspired. Create one piece of evidence, then another. And when you fail, do not use the failure as an excuse to disappear. Return. Self-trust grows through repetition, not intensity. Eventually, your relationship with yourself begins to change. Instead of saying, "I hope I'll follow through," you begin thinking, "I know what I need to do, and I can count on myself to take the next step." That belief cannot be borrowed. It cannot be purchased. It has to be built. One promise, one action, one return, one day at a time. Chapter 11. Build a personal system that carries the load. Daniel had spent months changing individual behaviors. He had learned to protect his attention, simplify decisions, adjust his surroundings, pause before reacting, and keep realistic promises to himself. But one problem remained. Too many of his improvements still depended on remembering to do them. He realized that if his organization required constant mental effort, it was not really supporting him. He needed a system. At first, Daniel imagined something complicated, a detailed schedule, multiple applications, color-coded lists, strict routines for every hour. Then he rejected the idea. He did not need a complicated life management machine. He needed a few reliable structures that would reduce mental effort. He started with his mornings. Instead of waking up and immediately deciding what the day should become, he identified one meaningful priority before getting pulled into smaller responsibilities. Then he created a simple evening reset. What did I finish? What still matters? What needs attention tomorrow? He wrote down the answers and closed the notebook. That final step was important. His brain no longer had to keep rehearsing unfinished tasks simply because it was afraid of forgetting them. Daniel then created a simple place for important information. Tasks went in one system. Ideas went somewhere else. Appointments had a clear location. Important objects had consistent places. The goal was not perfect organization. It was reducing the number of things his brain had to remember. He also created a reset plan for difficult days. This became one of the most useful parts of his system. When a day became chaotic, he did not try to restore the entire routine. He asked 3 questions. What actually matters today? What can wait? What is the next useful action? That was enough to prevent temporary chaos from becoming complete abandonment. Daniel also learned that a personal system must be flexible. His responsibilities changed, his energy changed, circumstances changed. A system that worked beautifully one month could become unrealistic the next, so he reviewed it regularly. What is helping? What feels unnecessary? Where am I repeatedly getting stuck? What could become simpler? Instead of defending the system, he allowed the system to change. That distinction prevented organization from becoming another source of pressure. Daniel discovered that a good system should make life feel lighter, not make him feel like he was constantly failing a schedule. He also learned to distinguish structure from control. Structure gives you a useful path. Control tries to eliminate uncertainty. Life will always contain uncertainty. So Daniel stopped trying to predict everything. He simply created places to return to, a place to capture tasks, a way to choose priorities, a method for starting important work, a process for closing the day, a reset for difficult moments. These simple structures became anchors. They did not remove responsibility. They made responsibility easier to manage. You can build your own system the same way. Do not start with 20 rules. Start with one recurring problem. Maybe you constantly forget tasks. Create one trusted place to record them. Maybe your mornings disappear before you begin meaningful work. Choose one priority the night before. Maybe your evenings become chaotic. Create a short closing routine. Maybe one bad day causes you to abandon your habits. Create a minimum version you can return to. The goal is not to control every minute. The goal is to stop solving the same problem repeatedly. Daniel eventually understood that organization becomes powerful when it moves outside your memory and into your environment. Your brain is designed to think, create, solve, and respond. It does not need to function as a storage unit for every unfinished responsibility. Build structures that carry some of the load. Then your mind has more room for what actually matters. A personal system is not a prison, it is support, and when designed well, you stop spending your life trying to remember how to stay organized. You simply have a reliable way to return whenever life becomes complicated. Chapter 12. Protect your mental space before it gets crowded. Daniel had built a practical system for managing responsibilities, but he began noticing a quieter problem. His schedule could be organized while his mind still felt full. There were messages he had not answered, conversations he kept replaying, ideas he did not want to forget, and small worries about tomorrow. Nothing seemed overwhelming by itself. Together, they created mental noise. One evening, Daniel closed his laptop after finishing work, yet his mind continued moving. He was already thinking about tomorrow. Then he remembered something he had forgotten. Then another thought appeared. He realized that stopping physical work did not automatically mean stopping mental work. He needed to learn how to close the day psychologically as well as practically. So Daniel created a simple shutdown habit. Before ending his workday, he reviewed what mattered. Anything unfinished was written down. Important tasks received a clear next step. Then he deliberately stopped. This did not eliminate every thought, but it gave his mind evidence that unfinished responsibilities had somewhere to go. He no longer needed to keep them active simply to remember them. Daniel also began protecting periods of quiet. He had become accustomed to filling every empty moment. Waiting meant checking his phone. Walking meant listening to something. Eating meant watching something. Boredom meant finding stimulation. At first, silence felt uncomfortable. His mind seemed to ask for something to consume. But Daniel stayed with the discomfort. Gradually, he discovered that quiet was not wasted time. It gave his thoughts room to settle. Ideas surfaced. Problems became clearer. Some worries became less important once he stopped repeatedly feeding them attention. He began understanding the difference between being informed and being mentally overloaded. Not every piece of information deserved his attention. Not every opinion required a reaction. Not every notification required an answer. Not every interesting idea needed to become a new project. Daniel became selective. He asked, "Does this help me think, act, understand, or connect?" If the answer was no, he became comfortable letting it pass. This applied to digital information, but also to conversations and commitments. He learned that mental clutter could come from people as easily as from screens. Some interactions consistently left him tense, distracted, or emotionally drained. He did not automatically blame those people. Instead, he examined his own boundaries. Was he responding too quickly? Was he agreeing to things he did not have capacity for? Was he taking responsibility for problems that were not his? Was he allowing every request immediate access to his attention? These questions helped Daniel understand that protecting mental space was not selfish. It was necessary. If your mind is constantly occupied, you cannot give your best attention to the people and responsibilities that genuinely matter. Daniel began using a simple phrase more often: "Not right now." A request could be important without being immediate. A message could be worth answering without requiring an instant response. An idea could be valuable without becoming today's priority. A problem could deserve attention without deserving today's attention. This distinction gave him freedom. He also became more aware of the difference between thinking and worrying. Thinking usually moves somewhere. It examines, it decides, it prepares, it solves. Worry often circles. The same question appears repeatedly without producing action. When Daniel caught himself circling the same concern, he asked, "Is there a useful action available right now?" If there was, he took it or recorded it. If there wasn't, he practiced letting the question rest. That was difficult, but he learned that not every problem becomes smaller because you think about it longer. Sometimes the mind needs permission to stop. You can practice this yourself. Choose one part of your day and protect it from unnecessary input. Put the phone away. Stop checking messages. Take a walk without constant stimulation. Sit quietly for a few minutes. Write down unfinished thoughts before bed. Give your mind somewhere to release what it has been carrying. The goal is not to escape the world. It is to create enough internal space to participate in it consciously. Daniel finally understood that a calm mind is not an empty mind. It is a mind with boundaries. It knows what deserves attention now, what can wait, what can be recorded, and what can simply be released. Your attention is limited. Your mental energy is limited. Protecting those resources is not laziness. It is responsible self-management. Because when you create space in your mind, you do more than reduce stress. You create room for better thinking, better habits, better decisions, deeper relationships, and a more deliberate life. And sometimes the most productive thing you can do is stop putting more into your mind long enough to make room for what is already there. Chapter 13. Make order part of who you are. Daniel had spent months learning techniques for becoming more organized. He had changed his surroundings, simplified decisions, protected his attention, created flexible routines, and built systems that reduced mental clutter. But eventually, he noticed something different. He was no longer thinking about organization as much. He simply behaved differently. His desk was usually clear because he naturally reset it. He recorded important tasks because carrying them in his head felt unnecessary. He paused before reacting because immediate responses no longer felt automatic. He protected focused time because distraction had become less attractive. The behaviors that once required deliberate effort were becoming part of his normal life. Daniel realized that this was the point where habits began influencing identity. At the beginning, he had thought, "I need to become organized." Now he was becoming someone who naturally valued order, clarity, and deliberate action. That distinction mattered. When a behavior is only a task, you can easily negotiate with it. But when it becomes connected to who you believe you are, the decision becomes simpler. Daniel was not trying to prove that he was disciplined every morning. He was practicing being a person who follows through. He was not trying to look productive. He was learning to become someone who respects his attention. He was not attempting to eliminate every mistake. He was becoming someone who knows how to recover. That last part became especially important. Daniel still had bad days. Sometimes he procrastinated. Sometimes he became distracted. Sometimes he reacted emotionally. Sometimes his schedule fell apart. The difference was that he stopped turning temporary behavior into permanent identity. A bad day became a bad day. It did not become, "This is who I am." If he lost focus, he returned. If he missed a habit, he restarted. If he made a poor decision, he examined it. If he became overwhelmed, he simplified. He learned that identity is reinforced not only by success, but by recovery. Every return told his mind something important. I am someone who comes back. That became more powerful than perfection. Daniel also stopped measuring himself only by productivity. He had once believed an organized person should always be accomplishing something. Now he understood that organization should support a meaningful life, not consume it. Sometimes the organized choice was to work, sometimes it was to rest, sometimes it was to have an uninterrupted conversation, sometimes it was to say no. Sometimes it was to step away from a problem until he could think clearly. Order was no longer about squeezing more activity into every hour. It was about making room for what mattered. Daniel began asking himself a new question when making everyday decisions. What does the person I am becoming do next? The question did not demand perfection. It created direction. If he wanted to become more focused, he knew what to practice. If he wanted to become reliable, he knew what to demonstrate. If he wanted to become calm, he knew he needed to create pauses. If he wanted to become disciplined, he knew action had to continue even when enthusiasm disappeared. Identity was no longer an abstract idea. It was being built through ordinary behavior. That is true for you as well. You do not need to announce that you are disciplined. Show it through one action. You do not need to declare that you are organized. Create one system that makes your life easier. You do not need to convince yourself that you are calm. Practice pausing when your emotions rise. You do not need to become perfect. Become consistent at returning. The person you become is shaped by what you repeatedly do, especially when nobody is watching. Every small action is evidence. Every choice reinforces a pattern. Every repeated pattern strengthens an identity. Daniel eventually stopped asking when his transformation would be complete. He understood that there was no finish line. Organization was not a destination. It was a way of operating. There would always be new responsibilities, new challenges, and new opportunities to practice. The goal was not to reach a point where he never struggled. The goal was to become better equipped to handle struggle without losing direction. That is the real power of an organized mind. It does not make you less human. It makes your actions more intentional. It gives your values a structure. It turns good intentions into repeatable behavior, and over time, those behaviors become part of who you are. Daniel had started by trying to organize his life. He ended up learning how to organize the person living it. Chapter 13. Make order part of who you are. Daniel had spent months learning techniques for becoming more organized. He had changed his surroundings, simplified decisions, protected his attention, created flexible routines, and built systems that reduced mental clutter. But eventually, he noticed something different. He was no longer thinking about organization as much. He simply behaved differently. His desk was usually clear because he naturally reset it. He recorded important tasks because carrying them in his head felt unnecessary. He paused before reacting because immediate responses no longer felt automatic. He protected focus time because distraction had become less attractive. The behaviors that once required deliberate effort were becoming part of his normal life. Daniel realized that this was the point where habits began influencing identity. At the beginning, he had thought, I need to become organized. Now he was becoming someone who naturally valued order, clarity, and deliberate action. That distinction mattered. When a behavior is only a task, you can easily negotiate with it. But when it becomes connected to who you believe you are, the decision becomes simpler. Daniel was not trying to prove that he was disciplined every morning. He was practicing being a person who follows through. He was not trying to look productive. He was learning to become someone who respects his attention. He was not attempting to eliminate every mistake. He was becoming someone who knows how to recover. That last part became especially important. Daniel still had bad days. Sometimes he procrastinated. Sometimes he became distracted. Sometimes he reacted emotionally. Sometimes his schedule fell apart. The difference was that he stopped turning temporary behavior into permanent identity. A bad day became a bad day. It did not become, "This is who I am." If he lost focus, he returned. If he missed a habit, he restarted. If he made a poor decision, he examined it. If he became overwhelmed, he simplified. He learned that identity is reinforced not only by success, but by recovery. Every return told his mind something important. I am someone who comes back. That became more powerful than perfection. Daniel also stopped measuring himself only by productivity. He had once believed an organized person should always be accomplishing something. Now he understood that organization should support a meaningful life, not consume it. Sometimes the organized choice was to work, sometimes it was to rest, sometimes it was to have an uninterrupted conversation, sometimes it was to say no. Sometimes it was to step away from a problem until he could think clearly. Order was no longer about squeezing more activity into every hour. It was about making room for what mattered. Daniel began asking himself a new question when making everyday decisions. What does the person I am becoming do next? The question did not demand perfection. It created direction. If he wanted to become more focused, he knew what to practice. If he wanted to become reliable, he knew what to demonstrate. If he wanted to become calm, he knew he needed to create pauses. If he wanted to become disciplined, he knew action had to continue, even when enthusiasm disappeared. Identity was no longer an abstract idea. It was being built through ordinary behavior. That is true for you as well. You do not need to announce that you are disciplined. Show it through one action. You do not need to declare that you are organized. Create one system that makes your life easier. You do not need to convince yourself that you are calm. Practice pausing when your emotions rise. You do not need to become perfect. Become consistent at returning. The person you become is shaped by what you repeatedly do, especially when nobody is watching. Every small action is evidence. Every choice reinforces a pattern. Every repeated pattern strengthens an identity. Daniel eventually stopped asking when his transformation would be complete. He understood that there was no finish line. Organization was not a destination. It was a way of operating. There would always be new responsibilities, new challenges, and new opportunities to practice. The goal was not to reach a point where he never struggled. The goal was to become better equipped to handle struggle without losing direction. That is the real power of an organized mind. It does not make you less human. It makes your actions more intentional. It gives your values a structure. It turns good intentions into repeatable behavior, and over time, those behaviors become part of who you are. Daniel had started by trying to organize his life. He ended up learning how to organize the person living it. Chapter conclusion. Build a mind you can rely on. Daniel's journey began with a simple problem. His life felt more complicated than it needed to be. His days were crowded with unfinished tasks, distractions, impulsive decisions, inconsistent habits, and constant mental noise. He believed he needed more motivation and stronger discipline. Over time, he discovered something more useful. He needed a better way to direct himself. An organized mind is not a mind that controls every detail. It is a mind that knows what deserves attention and what does not. It understands that habits are built through repetition, not dramatic promises. It recognizes that motivation can help, but it cannot be trusted to appear on command. It creates environments that support better behavior instead of depending entirely on willpower. Daniel learned to make important actions easier to begin. He trained his attention to return when it wandered. He created flexible rhythms instead of unrealistic schedules. He reduced unnecessary decisions and stopped carrying every responsibility inside his head. He learned to pause when emotions became intense rather than allowing temporary feelings to make permanent choices. Most importantly, he rebuilt self-trust. He stopped making enormous promises and started keeping smaller ones. Each completed commitment became evidence that he could rely on himself. When he failed, he stopped turning one mistake into an identity. He returned, adjusted, and continued. That lesson matters because real life will never remain perfectly organized. There will be difficult weeks. There will be unexpected responsibilities. There will be mornings when motivation disappears. There will be distractions you did not anticipate. There will be moments when your carefully planned routine collapses. The goal is not to prevent those moments. The goal is to become someone who can recover from them. Your organized mind should be a place you can return to when life becomes noisy. When everything feels urgent, ask what matters now. When motivation disappears, take the smallest useful action. When your attention wanders, return. When your emotions rise, pause. When your system stops working, simplify it. When you break a promise, repair it. When you have a difficult day, do not throw away the entire journey. Start again. You do not need to transform your entire life in one dramatic decision. Your life is being shaped through ordinary choices that seem insignificant while you are making them. One habit, one boundary, one focused period, one deliberate response, one completed promise, one return after a setback. These small actions gradually become patterns. Patterns influence identity. Identity shapes behavior, and behavior, repeated over time, shapes the life you experience. So take one idea from this audiobook and put it into practice today, not tomorrow. Today, make one part of your life slightly clearer. Remove one unnecessary distraction. Protect one block of attention. Create one useful default. Keep one small promise. Then repeat. The real power of an organized mind is not that it makes life effortless. It makes you more capable of meeting life as it is. Calmly, deliberately, consistently. You cannot control every circumstance, but you can become more intentional about how you respond. And that may be the most valuable form of organization there is. Not organizing every detail around you, but becoming the kind of person who can remain clear when everything around you becomes complicated.